Even before the collapse of the Soviet Union, there had been signs of a thaw in the Cold War. By 1985, the ascent of Gorbachev to leadership, culminating in the demise of the Soviet Union in 1991, brought an end to almost half a century of bitter rivalry between the world's two superpowers. The accession of Gorbachev to power in the Soviet Union in 1985 eventually brought a dramatic end to the Cold War. Gorbachev was willing to rethink many of the fundamental assumptions underlying Soviet foreign policy, and this was known as New Thinking. And this opened the door up to a series of stunning change. Gorbachev initiated a plan for arms limitation that led in 1987 to an agreement with the United States to eliminate intermediate-range nuclear weapons. Gorbachev hoped to make extensive economic and internal reforms, and the U.S. had serious deficit problems. During the Reagan year, the United States had moved to creditor nation to a debtor nation. By 1990, both countries were becoming aware that their large military budgets made it difficult for them to solve their serious social problems. Settlements came unstuck as a mostly peaceful revolutionary upheaval swept through Eastern Europe. Gorbachev's policy of allowing greater autonomy for the communist regimes of Eastern Europe meant that the Soviet Union would no longer militarily support the communist governments that faced internal revolts. Due to the Persian Gulf War, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the New World Order, which was how others predicted the beginning of the new American century, it became apparent around the world that the age of conflict was not at an end, but beginning to take a new form. In Southeast Asia, even before the end of the Cold War, former allies in China, Vietnam, and Cambodia turned on each other in a conflict that joined territorial ambitions with suspicions due to past conflicts. The pattern was repeated elsewhere. In Africa, where several nations erupted into civil war during the late 1980s and 1990s, and into the Balkans, where Yugoslavia broke apart into a bitter conflict that wasn't completely resolved, and in the Middle East, where disputes in Palestine and the Persian Gulf have grown in strength and erupted into open war. In 1996, President Clinton called terrorism the enemy of our generation, and since the Cold War, it has often seemed that terrorism has replaced communism as the West's number one enemy. Terrorist acts garnered considerable media attention. When Palestinian terrorists kidnapped and killed 11 Israeli athletes at the Munich Olympic Games in 1972, hundreds of millions of people watched it unfold on TV. Terrorist acts also stem from militant nationalists who wish to create separatist states. Because they receive considerable support from local populations that are sympathetic to their cause, these terrorist groups could maintain their activities over a long period of time. On December 21, 1988, Pan American Flight 103 from Frankfurt to New York exploded over Lockerbie, Scotland, killing all 258 passengers and crew members. A massive investigation revealed that the bomb responsible for the explosion had been planted by Libyan terrorists. And then on September 11, 2001, 4 groups of terrorists hijacked 4 commercial jet airplanes, and one of them slammed directly into the Pentagon, the other in an isolated area in Pennsylvania, and the other of the 2 airplanes were flown directly into the towers of the World Trade Center in New York City, causing these buildings and the several buildings to collapse. The terrorist organization of Al-Qaeda, run by Osama bin Laden, was the one who coordinated these acts of terror. Bin Laden was also suspected of directing earlier terrorist attacks, including the bombing of 2 U.S. embassies in Africa in 1998 and an attack on a naval ship in 2000. U.S. President George W. Bush vowed to wage a lengthy war on terrorism and work to create a coalition of nations to assist battling the world of Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups. In October of 2001, United States and NATO air forces began bombing Taliban-controlled command centers, airfields, and Al-Qaeda hiding places in Afghanistan. On the ground, Afghan forces opposed to the Taliban, assisted by U.S. Special Forces, pushed the Taliban out of the capital city of Kabul and seized control of nearly all of the country by the end of November. In 2002, President George W. Bush charging that Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein had not only provided support to bin Laden's terrorist organization, but also sought to develop weapons of mass destruction, threatened to invade Iraq, and remove him from power. The United States was forced to attack Iraq with little world support. The plan to attack upset many Arab leaders and fanned anti-American sentiment throughout the Muslim world. By 2006, violence had increased dramatically, and Iraq seemed to be descending into a widespread civil war, especially between the Shiites, who controlled southern Iraq, and the Sunnis, who controlled central Iraq. One of the major sources of terrorist activity against the West, especially in the U.S., has come from some parts of the Muslim world. The ongoing Israeli-Palestinian conflict, in which the U.S. has steadfastly supported Israel, helps give rise to anti-Western and especially anti-U.S. feeling among many Muslims. In 1979, a revolution in Iran that led to the overthrow of the Shah and the creation of the new Islamic government by Khomeini also fed anti-Western sentiment. The involvement of the U.S. in the liberation of Kuwait in the Persian Gulf War also had unexpected consequences in the relationship of Islam and the West. The U.S. attack on Iraq in 2003 further inflamed some Islamic groups against the West, and although many Iraqis welcomed the overthrow of Saddam, the deaths of innocent civilians and the torturing of prisoners by American soldiers in prisons in Iraq served to deepen anti-American sentiment in the Muslim world.